My name is John Powers, and thank you for once again joining me on a journey of discovery of our community. I know in the last few programs I have not included myself making introductory remarks such as I'm doing right now, but I felt with this program it would be helpful to you. Recently I attended the annual Day of Remembrance at the Gardena Valley Japanese Cultural Institute. Now, the Day of Remembrance, for those of you who are not aware, is a recognition of the event in February of 1942 when President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which in effect stripped the constitutional rights of more than 110,000 people and forced them to evacuate from the west coast of the United States, and eventually landed nearly all of them in prison-like concentration camps spread throughout the United States. I might add, in some of the most desolate parts of the United States, often forming the largest or among the largest communities in those states, those areas. Well, on the occasion of this year's Day of Remembrance, the Gardena Valley Japanese Cultural Institute focuses on the role of women in their families in these camps. And what we're going to be experiencing is a panel discussion that took place after the showing of a film. Now, we're not going to see that film on this program here, but we will be experiencing members of the panel talking about the film to some degree, but also, and more to the point, talking about their own experience dealing with their mothers or grandmothers and what they learned from them in their personal experience in going through this injustice now more than 70 years ago. We will then break, and there'll be the second half of the program in which we'll be looking at one individual in particular, a woman who holds a special place in the Japanese American community, Aiko Herzig-Yoshinaga, but more about her later. For now, let us listen to the members of this panel and leaders from the Japanese Cultural Institute introduce this program and begin their discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Allison Kochiyama, and I'm the Executive Director of the Gardena Valley Japanese Cultural Institute. And welcome and thank you for coming to today's 7th Annual Day of Remembrance, which also marks the 76th anniversary of the Japanese American incarceration and the 30th anniversary of the redress and government apology when President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. The Gardena Valley Japanese Cultural Institute is a nonprofit community center which offers a variety of programs, activities, and services for all ages and interests, 7 days a week. So we ask that, if you're interested in finding more about our community center, we have an information table staffed by our board member, Steve Awakuni, over there, and you can learn more about what we do, what all happens here, and how you can get involved, and also lend support. I would like to also thank the community supporters who are here today, and they are listed on the back of your program. They help to promote this event amongst their members, and all of them are doing important work, wonderful work, and I encourage you to learn more about what they do by visiting all of their tables as well. We would like to acknowledge the elected officials' representatives who are present here, and if you can please stand when I call your name. We have Congresswoman Maxine Waters, represented by Hamilton Cloud. And believe, okay. And then I wanted to acknowledge someone who's very special, Aiko Herzig-Yoshinaga, whose research played a crucial role in the success of the redress movement. So Aiko, please stand up. So each year, our Day of Remembrance events highlights a different theme. And this year, our Day of Remembrance committee, thank you to our hardworking volunteers and staff, chose the theme Women of the Camps. And we are very excited to showcase Marlene Shigekawa's film For the Sake of the Children, and to also have a stimulating panel discussion following the film. February 19th is a significant date for the Japanese American community. On this day in 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which gave the U.S. Army the authority to remove civilians from the military zones established in Washington, Oregon, and California during World War II. This led to the forced removal and incarceration of over 110,000 people based solely on race, without evidence of wrongdoing, charges, or hearings. More than 2/3 of those incarcerated were U.S. citizens. These people had to abandon their jobs, their homes, and their lives to be sent to one of the 10 U.S. concentration camps scattered in desolate, remote regions of the country. No Japanese Americans were ever charged, much less convicted of espionage or sabotage against the United States. Yet they were targeted, seized from their homes, rounded up, and imprisoned for years, simply for having the face of the enemy. They lost their possessions, property, friends, community, and dignity, and years of their lives. And many even lost their lives. Today, the U.S. government continues to pass laws and enforce policies targeting specific communities. The Muslim ban, deportations, indefinite detentions, border walls, racial profiling, and government surveillance are all happening now. And we must continue to defend our citizens and immigrant residents' civil and human rights. This is a repeat of what happened to our Issei immigrant generation in 1941, where over 1,200 Japanese immigrant Issei men were arrested by the FBI, and more than 5,500 Issei men were eventually picked up and held as potential threats to national security. Our hope is that these annual Day of Remembrance events held around the country not only continues to bring awareness of this dark episode of the U.S. history, but that people connect what happened in the past to present-day issues. There are so many issues we are seeing daily. We are also seeing women standing up to be heard through the women's marches and the Me Too movement. So we are very happy to present this theme today. We hope that diverse communities can come together to dialogue, build trust, respect, and understanding among all people. So thank you again for your participation in coming to today's Day of Remembrance. Thank you.
Marlene Shigekawa is not only an acclaimed filmmaker and screenwriter, but also an author of children's books, such as Blue Jay in the Desert. Mary Hatsuko Higuchi is an award-winning artist whose paintings conveyed life in the World War II camps, which you can see over there. And her paintings also raise questions about civil liberties and racial profiling. Asma Ahmed, a UCLA alum, is the policy manager at the Council of American Islamic Relations, Los Angeles, addressing issues affecting Muslims, immigrants, refugees, women, and others. Samir Ahmed is a staff attorney at the American Civil Liberties Union of Southern California, focusing on Muslim immigrants' rights. And Monica Embry, who you've also seen in the film, works with the Sierra Club to organize around environmental issues, and she is a member of a Manzanar committee. So my first question for the panel is, in the process of making this film, what did you learn about women's roles in the camps? Ise, Nisei, and Sansei, or Sansei.
Maybe I can start off. Can you? So the film really came about when my friend Ruth Okimoto and I were having coffee. Ruth was instrumental in the preservation project at Poston, initiating conversations with the tribe. So she and I were having coffee one day, and it was during the time that the men were getting a lot of recognition for their efforts with the 442nd. And we said, well, what about the women? The women were as brave and courageous during that time because they raised children in camp, gave birth to babies, such as myself and my brother and others. And they created a kind of normacy for all of us and kind of protected us. So we said, well, that takes a lot of courage and fortitude. So we started off with that idea, and we wanted to do a film about the women. And as we began to find some of these survivors, my mother was one of them, but my mother was really quite ginky, hardy, and she was 103 when we interviewed her, and still, she was still able to boss my sister and I around. And so but as we began to talk to other women and find women that were her peers, they were more fragile than her and not as able to communicate their experiences. And our director, Joe Fox, and I began thinking about how to expand the film. And after he interviewed me, he was very surprised to learn that I didn't know about camp until high school. And as we began to interview others, we found that same situation where a lot of the camp stories were not shared within the family. So then we decided to broaden the film and include the impact of the whole camp experience on the generations. So that's kind of how the focus on women began.
Well, for my mother, I know it was a very difficult journey. In camp, she had when we went into camp, she had 2 small children. And in camp, she had 2 more. During that time, they didn't have disposable diapers too, so can you imagine washing those diapers every day, hanging them outside on clothesline with the dusty windstorms in Arizona. She had to bring them into the house, drive them along on the ropes she had strung across the room with water dripping on the floor. Life was hard, taking 4 small children to the mess hall every day. It was just a difficult time for her, and so I feel for her. And it also brings me to tears just to imagine all she has gone through.
I think I have a pretty unique Japanese American experience in that I grew up learning about camp and knowing a lot about it because of my grandmother. And so when I think about women in the camps and reflecting a lot in doing this film, I actually think a lot about the role of women in being on the forefront of social change. Our movements today, I think, are really having strong, powerful women who are the ones out there advocating for the justice and equality for all of our communities. And I think it shows up in many different ways, and sometimes it looks like the person behind the bullhorn, and sometimes it's me thinking about working with my aunts to make spam musubi at every pilgrimage, right? And so I think women show up in so many different ways in holding families together, in caring for our communities, and standing up and raising their voices for what's right. And so for me, a lot of what in having the opportunity to reflect as part of this film has been thinking about the role of women in our movements in our world kind of more broadly too.
Thank you. I realize that, oops, sorry. I should just shout. I realize that men and women shared many common experiences in the camps, the frustrations, the sense of betrayal, confusion, deep losses. But I'm curious to know what you may think about how the ways in which women might have been affected differently by camp than men in the camp.
And they lost everything. Actually, they didn't realize they lost it until we came back, because we had neighbors take care of our things in the garage. But when we did come back, there was nothing left. It's been a real difficult life for her. I can't think right now. Just a little flustered. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that come to mind for thinking about women in camps. And I think a lot actually around women's health. The number of miscarriages and women who didn't survive childbirth and death was much higher in camps than outside of the barbed wire fences. And so thinking about access to health care and the way that disproportionately then was impacting moms and young women in camp, I think is really important to remember and see. And then I think the other theme that was brought up so many times in the film is the role of women in helping instill in their children a sense of self and self-worth. And how do you explain to kids that are trying their very best? And I think, the women really did a huge role to help kids have fun in camp and be shielded from what it meant to have guard towers where machine guns were facing in and living behind barbed wire. And I think women in the community were the ones who were really coming together to help make sure that young people were having, and their kids were having as good of experience as possible, from the schools to the games, to the plays, to the dances, all of those things.
I also read a study about men too. 40% of the men that were incarcerated died before reaching the age of 60. So a lot of the men were stressed out too.
So what I experienced to create kind of our town, kind of normalcy, so that the children could feel like they were a part of mainstream society, when in fact we were all rejected and marginalized and looked down upon. And that, I think, continued after camp. And I got an interesting question from Dr. Ron Brown, whom I worked with for many years as a diversity consultant. And he asked me if my parents and my mother had shared more about camp, would that have, their silence around camp, would that have affected you differently? How would it have affected you differently if you had known? And I just thought about that, and I feel like the silence, in some ways, it's kind of like a double-edged sword, in that the pain is there and you can't figure it out, and you feel you just feel bad about it. On the other hand, why they're not talking about it and having these set high expectations for us, then it enabled me, and I think my sister and my brother, to reach for the stars, to feel that we were like everybody else, that we can achieve everything that we wanted to, and that there were no roadblocks, when in fact there were, as we found out later. But in some ways I felt that was an advantage. So there's, assets and liabilities, and we experienced both, but I appreciated my mom for everything she did in trying to create a path for us into mainstream society, and at the same time knowing that we were Japanese, but not giving us all the information.
Valerie, can I say something else? When I did my first painting about the Executive Order 9066, I asked my mother what she thought. And she looked at it, and she just looked at it for a long time, and she just started having all those tears, and she said, all she kept thinking about is, when is the war going to end? What's going to become of my children? What will happen to them? And this is all she thought about every single day, worried about the children.
Thank you. That's, excuse me, sorry. Creature of habit, I still think this might work. Thank you for those powerful words. I'd like to shift a little bit. Women have played, as was noted in the film, women have played a range of roles in Japanese American community organizing, particularly in the redress movement that culminated in the passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. And so I'd like to ask Asma and Samir, what roles do women play in your organizations?
She's a prominent civil rights activist. And at CARE-LA, we have our operations director is a woman. I'm in a management position. We also have our Immigrants' Rights Center is managed by a woman. So I think throughout CARE, as we really believe in women, and especially women of color, in positions of power.
Hi. First, I just wanted to say it's an honor to be here with you all and to get to watch such an amazing film and to represent my organization, the ACLU of Southern California. Women in our organization play a huge role both on the national level and on the local level. Many of our actually executive director for many, many years, Ramona Riffin, was a woman and kind of probably one of the leading civil rights activists in Southern California. Currently, I think more than half of our project directors are women, including my boss, Jenny Pasquarella. She's the head of our Immigrants' Rights Project, and I would say one of the leading immigrants' rights lawyers, not only in LA, but around the country. One case that I'm working on with her is, you're probably familiar with Donald Trump wants to do this extreme vetting program of Muslim immigrants, and we filed a class action lawsuit, and Jenny actually not only uncovered that program, which some of it was happening under Obama as well, but now is the lead lawyer in this lawsuit across the entire country representing immigrants affected by these programs.
Thank you. I'm just going to shout. I would like to return to some of the things that the roles of women in your family after the war, because there's, of course, we know that post-war resettlement has been presented as some historians as actually an extension of the incarceration, because things were very difficult afterward.
You know, if you could use the microphone, it probably would project more.
All right. All right. I will be guided by the audience. Thank you. So, my question is, how did being in camp affect the roles of women in the family after the war? And did family dynamics change? Did work patterns change?
for my mom, she was kind of unusual in that she was a graduate of USC in a pharmacy school. So right before the war, she had a drugstore on Terminal Island. And they only had a few days to leave and evacuate. So it wasn't until I was an adult, probably in my 20s, that I asked her what had happened, and she said that she put a lock on her drugstore, and then she came back the next morning to pack everything up, and it was ransacked, and so she lost everything. So professionally, for her, before and after was very dramatic in that she had a business before the war, and then coming home, she had children to raise and did not have that business. On an emotional level, it was, I imagine as a professional woman and a graduate of a university, I saw pictures of her, and she had her own car before the war, and she seemed like a very independent woman. And then returning, I felt like in being raised, she had a lot of anxiety about and fear about doing the right thing all the time. And we always got these messages about, don't bring any shame on the family, always do the appropriate. So I feel like the camp experience impacted her emotionally in the sense that she felt like she couldn't be who she was as a Japanese American, but had to always anticipate how she would be received by mainstream society and adjust her behavior appropriately, and also to deal with just sexism and racism that some of us still feel today.
Did you want to add a little
We
something?
farmed there from 1946 to 51, moved to Torrance. But before we moved to Torrance, we put a down payment on 10 acres of land in Torrance. But before we were able to move there, my father had a heart ailment, and within a matter of weeks he died. And so my mother, with 4 young children, I was 13, my youngest was 7. We moved to Torrance, and she farmed those 10 acres by herself, raising 4 children, never giving up, worked so hard from early morning to late at night, plowing and having harnessing the horse and using a plow to cultivate and make rows and plant cauliflower and all of that by herself. She hired some worker, them to help her, but it was just one man to help her farm that land, and we would come home after school and help her as much as we could. But she had a very tough life after camp.
In this current political climate, what are your thoughts, or what words would each of you give to women, especially younger women, if it appeared that another group might be facing the kind of incarceration that Japanese Americans experienced?
Be strong.
For me, I think, one of the most powerful things about this film was that, today, the elephant in the room is we have Donald Trump as president. He's made a lot of immigrant communities feel very, very like they don't belong here. He's created policies that make a lot of people fear that they don't belong here. We all know about the Muslim ban. We fear that there may be a registry and other sort of policies that are like the internment. And I think what's so powerful about this film and what we can learn from Japanese women is, I tell people, they say, oh wow, isn't he the worst president ever? Isn't the worst time in America? And you just look, this happened under FDR, one of the most liberal presidents in the United States, who is doing this. And what these women experience in these camps are much worse than what things, thankfully, are going on now. And we can learn from their resilience. We can learn from, how they stayed strong when they were in the camps, and how they and the next generation is standing up and speaking up to help make sure things like this don't happen again. And the Muslim community is a very small percentage of the United States, and we can't fight back against these policies unless we have allies in other communities. I think that's really, really important.
So if I think about what the message I want to pass on to young women, I think it's a couple things. Be in touch, no matter of your racial, ethnic, religious background. Be in touch with your own family stories of hardship and struggle, because I think all of us, no matter what our race or background, has those, to share those stories. And also to be a part of a team of other people, whether it be Native American, Muslim American, Mexican American, anybody who has similar interests and struggle as yourself. And that I think it's important during this time to really reach out to other communities. We have reached out at our screenings to the Muslim community, because their struggle is our struggle right now. So I emphasize, and I would emphasize to everybody, to reach out beyond your own community to see how we can be helpful through sharing our own stories and our own struggle, so that we can all move forward together.
In 1942, very few people spoke out against this unconstitutional incarceration, right? A handful of Quakers, and not many others really did speak out. And so when I think about today, there are so many different social movements that, again, are being led by women, right? From the Movement for Black Lives, which is like a trio of powerful women that are speaking out. Me Too, an entire movement based on issues impacting women. And even this most recent terrible tragedy in Florida is being led by young women, right? Emma Gonzalez and others are the ones that are really speaking out. And so I think women's voices are really important today, and are critical that we listen to them. And my grandmother was known as the unquiet Mise. And she was acutely aware when she was growing up, her father had told her that she had 2 strikes against her. Right? First, she was Japanese American, and second, she was a woman. And so that meant she was going to have to work twice as hard to get half as far. And so thinking about when we're listening to women's voices, it's not shikata ga nai, it's not shoganai, it's gaman. And thinking about what does that endurance and persistence look like. As we're in this moment of resisting our administration, I think for me it's actually different. It's a moment of persistence, right? Many generations before us have been fighting for justice and equality for all people, and this is a continuation of that, and it's our duty then to speak out, and then to listen also when women's voices are speaking. So, thanks.
I'd just like to say one thing. Be strong.
Thank you, all of you.
Sorry, no, I'd just like to say a quick thing that after 9/11, the Japanese American community was the first community to come forward and show support to the Muslim American community and to CARE in particular. And so that's why this community is really near and dear to our hearts, and that's why we're so honored to be here today. And then since then, time and time again, the Japanese American community has showed up for us. We did a No Muslim Ban Never rally last year, and we in LA, and we started it at the Japanese American Cultural and Community Center. And so I think I would just tell young women today that it's important to learn how you behave in this world as an impacted individual, but also as an ally. And And the most important thing about being an ally is that you support and you strengthen, but then you step back. Because at CARE, we really believe in uplifting the voices of the most impacted. And I think this film really does that very beautifully. And so yeah, thank you again for having us here.
Can I just share one last story? So we screened our film in October in Japantown in San Francisco. And on our panel we had Zara from CARE, and also Alan Nishio, who you saw in the film. And she told the story about when she was at Long Beach State as a student, and Alan was a dean. He was, I forgot what position, but he was a dean. And after 9/11, he approached the Muslim students there, and she remembered him and was so impressed. And they hadn't seen each other in 20 years. And some reason because I invited both of them, they were on the panel. And it was amazing, that they shared that story of building that coalition and supporting each other. Yeah.
So come and talk with them afterwards, so perhaps they will stay a few minutes afterwards to talk with all of you. But in the meantime, I'm going to turn this over to Nicole, who's going to be closing.
Thank you, Valerie, and all of our panelists. So before we close, I'd like to give a formal thank you again to Marlene, all of our wonderful panelists, and of course Valerie for their time, thoughts, and words today. And I also like to give a thank you to our Day of Remembrance Committee who put in their time to put this together. If you don't mind, can you please raise your hands to let people know your work. I'd also like to extend my thank you to the GVJCI staff for their staff support, and thank you to the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors Chairman Mark Ridley Thomas for a generous grant that supported this program, as well as our other Day of Remembrance related programs. Thank you to our donors, Dr. Inadomi, Dr. Hata, and Lois Toyama for those generous donations. Thank you again to our community supporters who helped us spread the word about our program today and lended their support. Not all of them are present today, but please visit the tables on both sides of the halls to learn more about their organization and the wonderful work they do in the community. Thank you to Boy Scouts Troop 683, our GVJCI Board of Directors, and last but not least, the Gardena Bowl Coffee Shop and At-Home Kitchen for catering the food today. After the program, we have refreshments in the back, so please enjoy them. And also on to my right, at the very end of the hall, we also have a collection of Mary Higuchi's artwork, inspired by her experience in camp. If you haven't done so already, please make some time to view her wonderful work. I hope you all enjoyed today's program. One of our goals here at the GVJCI is to preserve the history of the tragedy of 76 years ago and to educate those who are interested, as well as the next generation and onwards. Just as the Japanese Americans fought for their rights 76 years ago, it still continues today, and not just in the States, unfortunately. If I can direct your attention towards the flyer in your program booklet, you will see a call for action for the Japanese Latin Americans whose rights were stripped of just as the Japanese Americans were in the U.S. Please read the flyer for more information about the redress movement, and today they are asking for help to sign an online petition and share it with others. And lastly, because we are a nonprofit organization, we really rely on the help of volunteers like our Day of Remembrance Committee, as well as donations. If you enjoyed today's program, please consider donating. We have a donation box by the elevator at our info table. Your contribution will help us keep our programs open to all those who wish to learn more about our cultural history and heritage at a low cost or free.
Thank you for listening to that portion of the program. And now we are going to experience one person's recollection of the events at that time of the camps, and in particular the time after the camps. And her perspective is very unique. Aiko Herzig-Yoshinaga plays a central role in the redress movement that occurred during the 1970s and during the Reagan administration, when the federal government made an apology to the Japanese community for the actions during World War II, and both an apology and a monetary settlement. Aiko played a central role on that committee that was bringing forth evidence to show the members of the federal government that their actions at that time were based on hysteria and in particular on racism. And there was no basis whatsoever to consider these people disloyal in any manner, and that the actions of forcibly evacuating and incarcerating them was an injustice. So we'll first hear Aiko talking about her experience as a young woman, 17 years old, being taken from Los Angeles, where she was a student at Los Angeles High School, and then her first experiences in the camp. But then, importantly, what was going on after the camp experience, those first few years, just how difficult it was for this one person in particular, and you can, draw your own conclusions what it must have been like for the 110,000 people, and by that point it was now 120,000 people who had been incarcerated simply because of the birth rate within the camps that had increased so much. So please continue to listen. Aiko has a unique story, and her memory is as clear as if it were yesterday. And I'll be back at the conclusion of her remarks. Thank you.
41, the year the war broke out. That was December 41, right? Yeah, it was December 7th. I was going to high school, Los Angeles High School. I was in the graduating class to be graduated in the springtime of 1942. And that's right, we heard the news. I'm sure it would happen to be on a weekend. We heard the news on the radio at a party. And it was all, of course, a great shock to us. And we weren't, at that moment, we didn't know how it would affect us, but we knew it would affect us and our families, because the enemy at the time on that day was Japan. And our parents were Japanese, were from Japan. So we knew somehow it would affect us. And we had no idea what that meant, actually. So there was a mixture of fear and question about what it would mean in our lives. I think that because the language barrier prevented me from discussing this with my parents, especially my mother, who didn't speak English, and I didn't speak Japanese, very little. So we didn't have a discussion about this. We just had to wait for the government to do what it will to our people, to Japanese and Japanese Americans who lived here. My father was not a prominent person in the community, so he was not apprehended by the government authorities for detention. He was a very strong Christian. So I don't know if that had anything to do with the fact that they left him alone. I doubt it, because I know that many Christian ministers were picked up and detained in government facilities. Well, at that time, we got in the spring of 42, we got word through notices nailed onto telephone poles in the streets of Los Angeles, all over the city, that persons who lived in certain areas, and they would precisely say what area of Los Angeles would be sent somewhere, would need to meet at a particular spot on a certain day to be removed from their homes in Los Angeles. If you lived on the east side of Los Angeles, middle Los Angeles, business section, or residential area in the west side, you are all going to be sent to different places. At that time, I was all of 17 years old, and the boyfriend that I had at the time lived on the east side of Los Angeles while I was way over on the west side. So when we found out that our families would be going to different places, and we didn't know where, I have no idea where it would be. So in the rush of and panic, being fearful that I would be separated from my then boyfriend, we eloped. He was like all of 19 and I was all of 17 or something like that. We eloped so that I could go with his family to wherever they were being sent. We were sent to Manzanar, which was at that particular time an assembly center. It was eventually turned into a permanent relocation, quote, concentration camp. Whereas my family were sent to Santa Anita, the horse race stables, and eventually they were moved to Arkansas, a permanent war relocation authority, WRA, permanent camp. So I ended up first in Manzanar with my husband's family, and a year later in Manzanar I gave birth to my first daughter. When eventually I received word that my family, which had been relocated to Arkansas, sent me word that my father was desperately ill. So I asked to be transferred to Arkansas, where he was, in order to be close to him. I eventually did get there in December, the early part of December, 1943. And my father died about 10 days after I arrived in Arkansas. At least I got to see him, and he got to see my first daughter. The camp administrators would not allow my then husband to be transferred also to Arkansas because they claimed that the man who was ill was not his father, but my father. So they were not going to allow him to move from Manzanar to California. But eventually, after working at it for half a year, he was allowed to come to Arkansas. But at the time, the Japanese American young men ages 17 and older were being drafted to serve the United States in the United States Armed Forces. And no sooner than my husband was transferred from Manzanar to Arkansas, he was drafted to serve in the armed forces. Speak of adding insult to injury, that was a very strong indication of what the government was doing, making such a terrible mistake. First, placing those of us who just happened to be born into this ethnic group into camp just due to our ancestry, and then drafting our young men to serve serve the government that imprisoned us. Speak of being insulted. And testing our loyalty to the country. Boy, what more evidence do you need than for us to question the promises of the Constitution, which we had certainly obeyed. We were a very law-abiding group of people. That was very hurtful. At any rate, the camp life was terrible, mostly because I think the biggest loss we faced was our freedom. Never appreciated what freedom meant until there was no way we could just leave the camps, which were surrounded by barbed wires and watched over by military police, to prevent us from leaving the camps. That's the same as a prison. There was no question about it. And then to have our young men being drafted to serve actions against them. The camp life was so confining, and although our young folks did not suffer the material losses that our parents did, it was still, as I said earlier, the lack of freedom that hurt us a lot. Well, the government decided eventually to allow young folks to continue their education if they were able to get an invitation from a university to attend the school. So many young folks took advantage of that and were able to leave the camps to go to these schools with the promise that there would be some other non-Japanese family who would be responsible for us. I would like to have done that, but I was pregnant and was not able to take advantage of that offer. However, after leaving the camp after having my daughter in Manzanar, California, moving to Arkansas camp to be with my father before he passed away, eventually leaving the camps in 1944. And I left first and I went to Denver, Colorado, because my in-laws had relocated themselves in Denver. But it was very difficult for me to make ends meet. And so I moved to Los Angeles, where more of my relatives lived. And very fortunately, just the very day that I arrived there, I bumped into one of my relatives who invited me to live with them. How lucky I was, very lucky, because I had no idea where we would be sleeping that very evening. So I had a very nice family in-laws where they had invited me to live there with my daughter Jerry, and they were also willing to keep an eye on little young Jerry while I went to school. And I entered an institute called the Stenotype Institute, where I learned to take dictation on a little machine called the Stenotype machine. It was a good thing I learned that, because that helped me many years afterwards to keep a job. I would always worked in offices, starting with office clerk, filing papers, and eventually taking dictation, and then working for usually health-related organizations. And I worked my way up from file clerk to secretary to assistant director of the international health section, and then eventually being assigned as a representative for the organization at the United Nations, representing this national health organization. It was a very good experience for me to be working at the United Nations. Made a lot of contacts. It was something I would have stayed with a long time if I had been able to. And eventually, though, I had to leave for whatever reason it was, and I got other jobs including working in a jazz-oriented organization, as well as doing a lot of typing work on scripts for productions, whether they're musical productions or any other kind of play. All of it was very good for me, and laid a groundwork for an eventual job with the United Church of Christ, where I worked my way up to becoming a representative of the health organization at various meetings and at the UN. Those days were days of experimentation for me, but it was really very good. It gave me a good background. And especially when I worked for the jazz organization as Jazz Mobile's office manager. I had a chance to meet some very famous jazz people, to be surrounded by almost always very upbeat people. It was and black, which is a good experience for me. I enjoyed that a lot. And then when I joined the church organization, that also expanded my experience and contacts. So now, where am I? I'm just finishing. I'm losing track of the timeline.
In working with the jazz organization, the Jazz Mobile, but also working with the health organization through the United Church of Christ.
Yeah, and yeah, okay, in the Church of Christ. Eventually, I ended up again in New York because my family had moved to New York from the camps. And that was also good for me, naturally, because my family was able to watch my kids. And I got married in somewhere along the line, the second time, for the second time. Yes, my second husband was in the Army, serving with he was a linguist, and we got married, and he was sent to Japan, from the multilingual school, and I enjoyed going to. Oh, we went to Japan and lived in a beautiful area near Kyoto. And Kyoto is famous for being not only a beautiful place, but the original capital of Japan, I think, was Kyoto. Which we, of course, moved to Tokyo later. The capital moved to Tokyo. But I lived near Kyoto in an Army-sponsored housing complex just south of Kyoto in an area called Otsu. And Otsu, where we lived in the mountains, looked out over a beautiful lake, famously known as Lake Biwa. It was a gorgeous place, and I was so fortunate to have been stationed there in the most envied place, and made a lot of Army friends, but we were not encouraged to to become too friendly with the local Japanese people, because the nature of my husband's Army work at the time was to ferret out communists in the Japanese community. And so the Army did not encourage us to mix in with the local population, because it would make it harder for my husband's work. So I regret very much that period where I thought I had a chance to know the Japanese people better. However, we were lucky enough to be situated in a part of Japan that was famous for its beauty, and to be located specifically in Lake Otsu, where the lake was nationally known as one of the most beautiful places in Japan. Well, in 1954, I'm quite sure that's the year, we were returned to the United States, where my husband was transferred to Washington State. I think there was near, what was the name of the camp? I forgot what the Camp Washington. At any rate, so we ended up there for a little while, but then what was the reason? I think I moved to New York with a job to work to make ends meet. So I moved to New York, and my family was good enough to help me raise the kids and to help me take care of the kids. Now, so see, we were, the husband and I were separated for a long time, and he eventually called me and said, you know, I want to get remarried, so would you be good enough to give me a divorce? I said, sure, you know, we weren't living together anyway, so we were divorced, and we've been friends. We were friends for a long time even after that, but he passed away some years ago. But I was glad that we had a good relationship because it affected the kids a lot. I think if separated or divorced parents can keep in touch with each other, and the kids could have good feelings about their parents, so I thought that was important. I was grateful for his attitude about that. Yeah. Now, after that, how long was it now? Oh, I know, when we were in Japan, we had made good family, we were good family friends with Jack Herzig and his wife. We used to see each other a lot at the Officers Club and get together once in a while for picnics. And during that long period, when Davis and I were separated, Jack lost his wife, and so he was free, and he was single. And during that period, it was 76, 77, 78, he got back in touch with me, and by that time, Davis and I were divorced, and he got in touch. We were in touch by Christmas cards and from occasional telephone calls anyway. But he called me one day and said, I'm here in New York, and let's go out to lunch. So we picked up our friendship again there, and by 1978, we decided that I should move down to Washington, where Jack was working at the Pentagon. I think it was still at the Pentagon. And so we lived in Virginia, adjacent to Washington, and had a nice life there. We were there for a long time, 50-something years altogether on the East Coast. My time on the East Coast, and then we decided to move to California to be with my side of the family. Since Jack had no sisters or brothers or didn't have ties to any families, so it was good for him to have that. He liked the temperature, the climate much better in California. So we moved to California, and unfortunately he passed away not that long after we had moved to California. So that brought us up to year 220, what is that, 2004, 2005 when he passed away. Now, what happened after 2005? Since I was with my family, I was very fortunate. In a terrible night, I'm trying to think what I did first when I moved out here. Did I ever mention to you what it was that I was doing when I first moved out here?
No. When you first moved out here, it was really just connected with relocating out here with Jack in order to be close to your family that had been out here then.
Yeah, right. So I picked up the threads with my family, and it's been a good life then, since I was pretty close to all my family members. It's been good.
Aiko, let me ask you, when you were in Manzanar
Yes,
with Jerry, you got word that your father was seriously ill. You petitioned and got permission to go to, is it Jerome?
yeah,
Arkansas?
Jerome first,
How did you get from Manzanar to Jerome with Jerry?
We took a train. I took a train, and I don't remember. It seemed to be days and days before we got there. But there was no seat on the train. And so I was sitting with Jerry on my lap, sitting on my suitcase for a couple of days, I think, well, at least a day or two. And eventually, a soldier gave up his seat. He said, "Here, you take this seat." He was very generous to give up his seat. So I was able to use that seat for the rest of the trip. And then when we got off the train in Arkansas, there was a bus. Bus was waiting to take those of us who had to go into the camp to Jerome Relocation Center, code relocation. When we got there, they dropped us off at the barracks. We were shown the building which was to be our home. It was a bare tar paper barrack. And at first, there were 3 of us families living together in one room. One family had a little daughter, or a sister-in-law with her husband had a little daughter. Another brother, older brother, my husband's another brother, and his wife, newly married, and then Jacob and me, newly married. So there were 3 different families in one room. And as I recall, the room was about 20 by 20 feet. We had separated our living space by hanging blankets between two of divided the one room into 3 separate rooms, and that was our abode for several months until they allowed us to have our own little space. So it was a good thing we all got along, because it's not very easy to have 2 newly married couples and another family with a baby all in one room, sharing the space, little space. when I think about it, I think, gee, it's a wonder, it was a good thing we got along so well. It would have been pretty tough if we did not respect each other. And it was a very difficult time for to make adjustments. And of course, one of the hardest things was the lack of being able to make your own food, your own meals. There were, as I recall, about 36 blocks, separate blocks in Manzanar. That did not include the hospital, I think, or the administrative offices. And we happened to live in block 6. Each block had 12 or 13 barracks. Yeah, I think it was 13 because the 13th was a recreation hall. 14th was a mess hall. We lived in a block 12, building 13, apartment 2. Yeah, that's what it, 12, 13, 2. And there was, the lack of privacy was bad enough, but then to have to line up for every single meal, particularly older people or people who were ill and had to have their meals brought home to them if they could not make it to the mess hall. 3 meals a day, waiting in line, no matter what the temperature was, no matter if there was a dust storm. It ain't easy. And to do that every day. Well, we were fortunate that the weather was bad from time to time, but on the whole, I think we were lucky. We were very lucky. So that was Manzanar. In Arkansas, the weather was not really very good. It was an area of Arkansas that was swampy and sticky, especially in the summer, and full of bugs. That was something I didn't enjoy at all. So I was glad when they decided to close that one camp. But then we got moved to another camp in another part of Arkansas, which is not much better. But at any rate, from the second Arkansas camp, when they started to close all the camps, I moved to Denver, Colorado. And I tried living there with another Japanese-American Nisei woman whose husband also was in armed services. And it was just too difficult trying to live very, very cramped quarters with another woman and her son. So moved myself back to California. And fortunately, my brother-in-law, through marriage, I bumped into the day we got there, and he invited me and Jerry to come and live with his family. And that was so generous, especially when they already had 20 people living in their one house. Boy, imagine being so big-hearted that you offer to share your home and the food and everything else. And such a generous family. I was so fortunate. I was so lucky. that I just worked to my advantage. And so I moved there, and they helped to take care of Jerry while I went to school and worked at the same time. Yeah, I was so fortunate. Eventually, I had to move back to New York. Yeah, I forget what the reason was at the time, but anyway, so my kids all grew up in New York, so they didn't have the advantage of knowing other Japanese Americans. So they had quite an adjustment to make when eventually they've all moved back to the Southern California. But it was a good experience, I think, for them to grow up in New York and to know people other than Japanese Americans. It was, I think, a good thing for them. Yeah. So.
Let me ask you, I'm going to go back to that question. So on this train trip from Manzanar to Jerome, you had a ticket, presumably, but there was no seat for you.
Yes.
And so it was on a passenger train, and you were forced to sit on your suitcase in the car, the passenger car, without a seat.
Yeah, that's right. And that's when eventually a soldier gave up his seat for me, and he took the suitcase and he allowed me to sit on his seat, which made it easier for me to change Jerry's diapers. It was very hard trying to work it with only on a suitcase, you know. Yeah, but it was so generous of the soldier. I really appreciated it. Yeah, because it was a long trip. As I recall, yeah.
Was there anything else that you encountered from people? Because you weren't under a guard, you just were under your own, I would say, I hate to use this word, recognizance. They said, get on the train and then get off in Jerome, is that right? And there was no special protection?
When we got off the train in Jerome, near Jerome, they put us on a bus.
Right.
So we went on the bus.
But you were all by yourself with Jerry on that train.
Right. Right. Yeah, it was a little tough.
Yeah. But could you have gone anywhere? Let's say, I don't want to go to Jerome. I want to go.
No. I had to carry an identification.
Okay.
So, I don't know if I would have been stopped by anybody, but since we were afraid and we didn't know Arkansas at all, I wouldn't know where to go. So the only thing to do is to do what the the police say we have to do. Yeah, it was a little scary.
Right. When you got to Jerome, and then as you said, 10 days later, your father passed away. What was your mother's situation at that time and going forward?
Yeah, my mother was not well because she had had sort of a nervous breakdown, but she handled it very well, I thought. And I had older sister there with their family. So she had moral support as well. So, but you know, the Japanese people are not all that emotional. They don't show their emotions. My mother was just like that. Yeah. All I have is a picture of the family funeral. I have the people who knew my father, who was in the camp. So I don't have very much I didn't have a chance to pick up our relationship, which was not very close, but since he died so quickly, you know, yeah. He had a cardiac problem, plus other major organs, but I don't know if he would have died if we didn't go to camp anyway, because of his health. However, it was not easy, you know, to deal with on top of everything else. Yeah.
Well, once again, thank you very much for taking the time to listen to these very perceptive individuals, these women who had their own experience or the experience of their mothers or grandmothers in the camps during World War II, and in particular, those years immediately after the camp. And so while the camp experience ended in the mid-40s, the trauma and the difficulties that the camp experience put on them, that the federal government and our society put on these people, continued for many years afterwards. And I dare say, reverberates through the Japanese American community today, more than 70 years later. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing you again on future programs. Goodbye.